Okay.
Should I mute at this stage?
No, you don't have to. You don't have to mute. I can pull you out of the stream. So good morning, colleagues, and welcome once again to Transforming Guyana and Season 2, Episode 7. I am Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics in the Department of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and founder of the Guyana Business Journal. And as is always the case, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. David Lewis of Manchester Trade and the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Today, in the light of the current events, the Venezuelan referendum that purports to annex and incorporate into its own territory Guyana's entire Essequibo region. And I should note here, I've heard in many news outlets the use of Essequibo. And I just want to be very clear that it is Essequibo, not Essequibo. This has always been the way that it has been pronounced. And so let me first note that today in Guyana, there is the funeral for the officers of the Guyana Defense Force and the ranks of the Guyana Defense Force who died in the unfortunate helicopter crash that has been in some sense precipitated by this Guyana-Venezuela controversy. And on behalf of the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium, we want to extend our deepest condolences to the families of the officers and ranks who unfortunately lost their lives in defense of Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We also want to offer thoughts and prayers for speedy recovery for those who survived the crash, and we send our best wishes to their families. In this matter of funerals, we also note the passing. I am, as many of you know, a cricket enthusiast, and we also note the passing of two very important Guyanese members of the Guyanese cricketing fraternity. Joe Solomon from Port Morant, who's part of that late 50s, early 60s players who kind of Joe Solomon, Basil Butcher, this group of players who really kind of put the West Indies on the map. And many of you will know that Joe Solomon is famous for being an integral part of one of the I think the only tied test match. So we say our condolences to the family of Joe Solomon, and also Clyde Butts, who I actually did know, and many of you will know is sort of an off spinner from Guyana who was probably one of the best of his day. Played, I don't think, many test matches for the West Indies, just about 7, but really, I actually think he was from Maikoni. Knew him moderately well, extremely humble man, and we also want to send our condolences to the family of Clyde Butts. And having said those things, I can now move on to the discussion. So as we have been doing over many months now, and I'll say some more about this, we have been engaged in these conversations to really offer a kind of nuanced look at some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that Guyana faces in relation to its emergence as you know. And I should, when I say the word petrostate, I don't mean all of the negative implications of petrostate, but I mean just simply that it's a state where its largest export is the petroleum products. Our conversation today is around the regulatory infrastructure that drives or that ought to undergird Guyana's emergence in this way. And we'll be joined by Dr. Thomas Singh, the director of the Green Institute, senior lecturer in the Department of Economics. He's worked in academia and the public sector and private sectors. His teaching and research has been in the general areas of applied microeconomics and econometrics, with a particular interest in environmental and natural resource economics and management, institutional and behavioral economics, and econometrics. Most recently, he has organized the annual Green Economy Workshop Series, and he has been critical in establishing the University of Guyana's Green Institute. Thomas holds a PhD in economics from the University of Kent, where his dissertation was to trust or not to trust others. And I'm sure perhaps your dissertation might have some implications on the Ali Maduro meeting. Thomas is also an active member of Guyana's civil society and founding president of the Epilepsy Foundation of Guyana. So, Dr. Singh, welcome to the GBJ and CPC Transforming Guyana webinar series. And at this moment, I would like to invite David to bring a word of welcome. And then I want to ask you, Thomas, if you would want to comment on any of the immediate issues that have, in a sense, overtaken our very deliberate study of these issues as they've gone along. So first, David, and bring a word of welcome, and then Thomas, if you wanted to comment on some of these matters that are directly in the media today. David?
Good morning, Terence. Good morning, Thomas, and good morning to our audience in Guyana, in the diaspora internationally that joins us monthly, faithfully and religiously to listen to our discussions and commentaries, and to join us as well in the chat. Yes, this is our last program for the year, and then we are all off for our holiday season, Christmas, Hanukkah, and so on. And then we'll also be planning to launch in the new year, and both GBJ and CPC probably sometime in the first quarter we'll be announcing some new initiatives we have for you in 2024, both in terms of the program aspects of our collaboration, but also for engaging broader and beyond our current audience and participants. So those of you with interests, with expertise, with issues to share, please reach out to Terence, to myself. We're always looking for new participants and speakers on different topics, and we are looking forward to a very engaging 2024, not just for Guyana, but for all related markets with regards to Guyana. During the program, I'll make some comments which have been part of our discussion over this year and a half, Terence, on the importance of building institutions, organizations, systems, procedures, and the role of both foreign and local capital and investment and businesses in helping Guyana build up that best practice, that benchmark in terms of not just the oil and gas economy, but pretty much open free market economy in a variety of sectors. I remind people, and we had a discussion on this in our recent webinar with CPC and the University of the West Indies on the Guyana border territorial dispute, that whether we like it or not, this experience, not only in terms of the oil and gas investment, but generally speaking, foreign direct investment and the entry of new capital, new businesses in Guyana is new. We are still talking about a history of the past 5 decades in which the view of both local and foreign capital in the mainstream polity of Guyana was negative. So this is, as I've always mentioned, and unfortunately I cannot put a patent or copyright on it, this is work in progress. This is relatively new, and anybody with some strain of gray hair can easily just remember the days when instead of talking about the benefits of private investment, of foreign capital, of companies, local, Caribbean, or international, coming into Guyana, people were talking very naturally that no, they should stay out. We don't want them. We want the state to run everything. So I think it's very important as we talk about the regulatory framework today, uh, not just to focus on the oil and gas regulatory framework, but what it means for the entire economy. We've had discussions on banking, on services and technology and so on education, on STEM, and pretty much it's clear that this is something that needs to be built in to the public administration of Guyana, the civil society, and the private sector in order to really take it to the level of the connotation that Terence mentioned of the petro state, and particularly the opportunity with the economic largesse that the oil exploration and sale and export is bringing to the state, and eventually will occur also with gas, and the trickle effect that that is having in so many different sectors of the economy. Pick the number. Is it 56%? Is it 34%? Oh my God, it may be 26% only in 2024, the growth rate of the Guyanese economy. And of course, in the rest of the world, you talk about 3%, and that is a major achievement. So I think it's important to keep all that in perspective, and we can get Thomas's view from the ground in Guyana. I know, I believe he was on leave this semester from the university, working on a new project, which he had mentioned to us before, and a new publication. So we certainly look forward to sometime in 2024 being able to highlight that. But right now, all to Thomas, and thank you all again. And at the end of the program, we'll let you know for our new episode in the new year. So thank you again.
So, Thomas, thoughts on the pressing issues that really impinge upon our country?
Good morning, Dr. Blackman. Good morning, Dr. Lewis. In thanking you and thanking you immensely for giving me an opportunity to share with your audience and with those who are taking an interest in things that are happening in Guyana. I'd like to say that it's not easy to sustain the initiative that you've been sustaining, and to congratulate you, to compliment you, and to thank you for doing this. I also thank you for the opportunity to reflect briefly on, from the ground, as David said, on issues confronting us today. Terence, you mentioned both the tragedies of the helicopter crash that took lives, as well as the incident involving the late cricketer, Clyde Butts. We also are thinking about, as we think about things that are happening, the threat from Venezuela. My comment probably is to say that risk, which is at the core of what we're talking about today regarding the oil and gas sector, standards and regulation, risk is at the core of all of these events. I worry that Guyana, having come out of an economy, as David said, that was state monopolized, is and embarking on a market economy is not always as able as well placed to understand market dynamics as we might like it to be, because one thing that we don't do very well, unfortunately, is to take account of the future, of uncertainty, and of risk. Regarding, let's say, Venezuela, as well as the other incidents, I think one way to characterize what's happening is that these issues are all low probability. That is to say, there's a very slim likelihood that there will be an invasion by Venezuela. I think if you were to ask anyone, there's a slim likelihood that Clyde Butts would have been involved in an accident. There was a slim likelihood that it would have been this horrendous helicopter crash. They're low probability, high impact events. If one were to look at the writings and the management of these events, low probability, high impact, high negative impact events, um, one would see that the best strategy is to manage risk very closely, to take risk very seriously. So when it comes to Venezuela, I might share briefly that I was in Venezuela on the 2nd of this December, just coincidentally. That was the day before the referendum. And speaking to people who were average folks, rice farmers and others, I was struck by their own insightfulness and awareness of the risks that confront them. And I'd like to share that. They do not expect that the risk will come from a military invasion. And I think that this is one rare instance when we could take Mr. Maduro, President Maduro, seriously when he says that there will be no military invasion. Rather, the sense is, and I share this sense, that the real risk is that there could be a significant influx of migrants. And those migrants, unfortunately, might include people who are who have criminal intent or who might have strategic objectives rather than just being economic migrants. If that were to happen, as you know, there could be no military response to that. That would be highly unacceptable. And the question would be whether Guyana has the capacity to manage an influx that large. The second point that I would make is that by Mr. President Maduro declaring Essequibo, correctly pronounced Essequibo,
Yes.
a state of Venezuela, he sent a signal. And in game theory, signaling is incredibly important when we're dealing with uncertainty. He sent a signal to people, his Venezuelan people, that if they were to migrate, it would be an internal migration. Now, that signal could be an important signal for those persons who are just on the threshold of deciding whether or not to make that move. So I think that's the nature of the threat that we might not be considering very seriously, but we ought to, because the view from the ground in Essequibo is if that happens, then all the assets, all the property of people who live there now becomes vulnerable. Not only that, politically, if that were to happen, if we were to think of 120,000 Guyanese living in the vast Essequibo region, and there's a movement of, just to pick a number, 75,000 people into the country, into the region. That's a very big movement. So we need to take that risk seriously. And if we were to think that, well, we can somehow or the other ignore what Mr. Maduro has said now already, about issuing licenses and that sort of thing, even of declaring the region of Essequibo a state of Venezuela. If we did that, we would be starting off on the wrong foot. I think everybody is encouraging our negotiators to take this seriously. Consider all elements of risk. That's what I meant by my reference to low probability, high impact events. That we must consider the full range of risks. That's a lesson that's taught to us from people who study these low probability, high impact events.
Yeah, I know as a mathematician, I often tell my students that low probability events do occur. They increase, and I often tell them low probability events occur quite frequently. If you just think of someone winning the lottery every week, the likelihood of winning the lottery is 1 in close to 80 million. But someone wins this lottery every week, and so these low probability events, people tend to underestimate the likelihood of low probability events occurring, and they can and what this leads to, as you've just described, is a sort of lack of preparedness and a failure to allocate resources for developing contingency plans for these kinds of events, and that failure to develop contingency plans for those kinds of events can lead to significant financial and other losses in this regard. I mean, I've long been I take this moment just to say that I have long been in November of 2012, I own a house in Canarsie in Brooklyn, and I was away on sabbatical like you are, and Sandy hit, and it completely changed my thinking about what low probability environmental events can do, and the need for people to be really prepared for them. And so I do think this is something that we ought to be very mindful of, and those of us who have some expertise in thinking about these kinds of elements of risk that you've just described really need to share with our policymakers some of the issues that can emerge in that context. So having said that, today's program was not aimed at that, and I thought I just wanted us to have a moment where we could just reflect on that, given that this is something that is really impacting people's minds and thinking at this moment. What I wanted to do, though, was to, in setting up part of the discussion that we wanted to have, given David's thought about this being the end of the year, I wanted to sort of broadly put in context for our viewers kind of what we have been doing, so to speak, over the course of the last 18 months. This topic for today specifically is about the importance of regulatory frameworks. And as our comments have just, as we just sort of commented, really they're as we see it, there are two broad buckets in which to think of this importance of regulatory frameworks, kind of ensuring as a mechanism for ensuring safety and sustainability, and as a mechanism for facilitating broadly sort of industry growth. And what we wanted to do, what I want to do, we're not going to get through my entire agenda here today, but what I wanted to do was to kind of broadly set the stage, and then get to the part of building blocks for a regulatory framework, and then think about the developing of legislation. And then what I'll do is I'll kick it to you, Thomas, to kind of weigh in on some of what I will have said by that time. There are a number of other areas which I wanted to dive more deeply into, but I think, given the constraints of time, etc., I'm probably not going to get into that. But I wanted folks to see the full overview of the thinking that we're trying to communicate to people, that is necessary in this moment in order for Guyana to turn this corner and to emerge as a place where people live in safety and security, with the opportunity for economic empowerment in this context. So just to set the stage, this is where we are. So Guyana is currently producing about 380,000 barrels per day, or equivalents of crude gas, making it is currently Latin America's 7th largest producer. Commercially recoverable petroleum reserves in Guyana now exceed 11 billion barrels, ranking us 3rd in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in some very real sense, establishing us as one of the global leaders in oil reserves per capita. the Exxon consortium aims to get to about 1.2 billion barrels per day of output by 2027. The key projects, the Liza Phase 1, which is already there at 120,000 barrels per day. Liza Phase 2 started up 2022, 220,000 barrels per day. Payara, which is coming on stream, about 220,000 barrels per day. And then Yellowtail, which we expect in 2025, about 250,000 barrels per day. And so if we think of what that looks like from an economic perspective, I just looked this up. The Natural Resource Fund has surpassed the US $2 billion mark in market value since its inception in 2019. This is October 2023 report from the Bank of Ghana, and we just saw some recent IMF data really giving some real projections about where so this is where we are. So in a very real sense, this is what is at stake in the conversations with Venezuela, in managing, as you say, Thomas, in managing the risk. And as a mechanism for managing the risk, we here at the GBJ CPC, we believe that, the ideas are important. And so we have essentially, in a way, created 6 buckets for how to think about Guyana in this context. We've thought of them in terms of challenges, and broadly 3 main challenges. The first, which we think is vitally important, which I just described from my own perspective here in relation to Standy, sort of balancing the growth of the oil and gas industry with environmental conservation. We've seen the discussions in COP28. This is the significant challenge. This is the essential challenge of our time. Ensuring that responsible practices emerge to minimize environmental impact of the exploration and production activities, mitigating potential oil spills, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I remember, some years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I was involved in some conference there around looking at spill dynamics, but I still don't see the emergence of the infrastructure that's necessary to manage the regulatory infrastructure, to manage these challenges that are on the horizon and will be challenges that we have to address at some point in the future. Perhaps we might be thinking that these are low probability challenges, but we ought to have an infrastructure in place for managing these. And I'll draw the attention of listeners to the white paper that we produced on the intersection of energy development and the environment in Guyana by Dr. Oliver Truss, which you can find on our website. The second key challenge, as we see it from the perspective of the GBJ and the CPC policy group, is building the infrastructure, and building the infrastructure in a cohesive and equitable manner. The pipelines, the ports, the shore bases, the processing facilities. And what we see is that developing these facilities efficiently and addressing the logistical and transportation issues, these are critical to ensuring the sector's smooth operation and for Guyanese to derive the full value from the sector. The third key challenge, and you can see that all of the programs that we've done are sort of, in a sense, fit into this. And the third key challenge, and this is the initiation of that discussion around the third key challenge, is that to do with the regulatory framework, establishing, enforcing robust regulatory framework, drafting legislation, setting industry standards, creating effective regulatory agencies to oversee the sector. And the key here is understanding that developing and implementing these regulations effectively, they're challenging, and I was hoping to have someone else speak to kind of locally what this challenge looks like in Guyana, so that we could really get a sense for individuals about what the contours of the job would look like in the context of Guyana. We're doing this job. This is not to say, and I'll note there, we're doing this job, but there are ways in which we can do this job in some sense a bit better. Just to move on, not just the challenges, but also we've spent time focusing on the key opportunities, right? So exploring, we have this, we have the series that we've been doing in person, and we've called it Navigating a Changing Guyana, where we looked at pathways to prosperity, and to think about the fact that, as we've just described, the oil and gas sector offers significant opportunities for economic growth, revenue generation for Guyana. And the question is, how do we unlock that in an equitable and sustained manner, so that oil and gas, as we know, is a finite resource, and when that resource is exhausted, Guyana should have been transformed and be set on a platform below which we cannot fall. If we miss this opportunity, then I think that we will look back, and our grandchildren will blame us tremendously for having not done the work that we needed to do. So we've spent time here at the GBJ and the CPC in these webinars focusing on the things that need to be done in order to unlock economic growth and revenue generation. The second thing that we've focused on has been job creation and skill development. And we've done a number of programs in this regard, right? So we've looked at the skills, the skills alignment. We've looked at ways in which we can quickly upskill the labor forces in Guyana. We've looked at ways in which we can quickly educate. We've partnered with the University of Guyana and talked about some of the plans that they have. And so the key understanding axiom, so to speak, for GBJ and CPC is that, look, this industry provides an opportunity for job creation, for skill development that will benefit local communities by offering employment opportunities and enhancing Guyana's workforce capabilities. And this is something that has to be thought about in a very serious way. And then the third aspect of this is the question of energy independence and diversification. As we all know, we live in a warming world, and the point for us to kind of understand is that developing this oil and gas sector can contribute to energy independence, diversification. We've done a white paper by Justin Ram on the gas to energy project. We've noted actually recently the pause in the, maybe this is something we can speak to in a subsequent program. We've noticed the pause in the gas to energy project. We've noted the reemergence of the Amelia Falls project on the horizon, but the key point, the key maxim, and what we've been doing, as you talked about this work, what we've been doing is saying, look, energy independence and diversification is important for Guyana. This oil and gas moment provides us with an opportunity to diversify and to ensure that we have a safe, sustainable, reliable, cheap source of energy, which is going to be the key for any developing Guyana as we move forward. And then finally, to the case where we want to have the discussion today, to think through building blocks of a regulatory framework that will enable that will catalyze that process. And in that context, legislative policies, regulatory agencies, kind of establishing standards and compliance, establishing mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement, establishing, we actually did just a few days ago, program on transparency and accountability. We've had programs on stakeholder engagement that look not only at the business community, but also look at hinterland communities. We have talked about capacity building and training. We've talked about data collection and training and reporting. We haven't had much discussion yet, but we will in subsequent webinars on Guyana's emergency capacity for emergency response and contingency planning, and more broadly, we've always talked about ensuring sort of an international collaboration. So before I invite you to kind of comment on some of what I've been saying. Key to the question of the legislative process that undergirds this, and I think the government must be commended for moving in this direction. I think it was just this year on August 9th, the government of Guyana passed the Petroleum Activities Bill, which in a sense updated the Exploration and Production Act of 1986, which provides for new laws as it relates to exploration, production, storage, and transportation of petroleum via pipelines. It better incorporates rights over subsoil geological space. There are a couple of elements here which have been debated in the press. The key, I suppose, the key component of the new legislation is that the Minister of Natural Resources, in a sense, has responsibility for enforcing the laws and applying fines. It sits, I said he, but I probably should have said the minister will operate under the nation's cabinet. And I note that there's not much mention of the regulatory agencies or exclusive sort of parliamentary attributions in this context. And I noted in the news reports that the opposition does indeed contend that the bill vests too much power in the office of the minister, and they have led a call to amend the bill to include the establishment of a petroleum commission, to argue that this is that there's a need for some separation because of the undue influence between the government and the sector. And so in a sense, this is kind of where I want to send the discussion to you. Give us your sense of, where we are in this regulatory regime, the importance of the regulatory regime, and what are some of the things that you think we ought to be doing in this context. And so I'll invite you in at this moment here, thoughts. You're muted. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Terence, for that very insightful introduction and background. I will share I do have...
Yes, so if you just hit the present button on the end.
Yeah. I'll share from my computer.
Yeah.
Do I have to upload my slide?
It will do it pretty quickly. Yeah, you don't
Very
have
well. I'll do that.
Yeah.
My apologies for not doing this a bit earlier.
Yeah.
But to be coming.
Yeah.
I should mention that I've given a particular title to, as it's coming up. I'm calling it Drilling Down to Incentives and Information, or Development and Enforcement Easier Said Than Done. But apologies for some fun, but here we go. You have that there.
Yeah.
Does this mean then, David, that you will move the slides, or do I move them? Hello? You're muted, David.
Yeah. I can move the slides for you, but you can move them also.
I could do them also. Very well, I'll do that. Okay, so drilling down to incentives and information, because incentives and information are at the core of whatever we try to do, and whatever we achieve as well. And that overview that you gave us, Terence, had a lot to do with incentives and information. I need to say something, however, just before getting into this presentation, because I won't say it again. And that is to say, from the perspective of the investor, getting a regulatory framework right is extremely important. It's important that the regulatory framework be reasonable and be predictable. Terence, you made reference to the fact that the final investment decision on the construction of the pipeline by ExxonMobil has not been made by the ExxonMobil board as yet. And I believe there are two elements to the pause. One is coming from Venezuela, an increase in political risk that should not be discounted, because the oil majors, all companies, all serious companies, take political risk very seriously and wouldn't assume that because of assurances we give them that Guyana is ours or Essequibo is ours, that will automatically remove the element of political risk that's been introduced by the referendum. The second element of risk that occurred that probably gave pause to that final investment decision came from a court ruling and a legal challenge. As you'd remember, some people took to court the issue of the environmental permit that was waived. And the court decision is an interesting one. The court decided that the project will go ahead, but it did say quite specifically that there was a breach of the law by not requiring an environmental permit. We are talking about a very serious and an oil major. It will take any court decision absolutely seriously. Now, if our regulatory framework allows for, we can't deal with political risk that comes from outside, but if it allows for a sudden increase in risk coming from any source, that will become a serious problem for investors and ultimately will have a negative effect on outcomes for ourselves. So investors require generally certainty, greater certainty, and given that we can't have absolute certainty, the investor will always prefer a regulatory framework that minimizes the sudden appearance of risks, that creates more predictability than will otherwise exist. I needed to say that at the outset because I don't think I will return to the investor's perspective again. Drilling down to incentives and information, because in your topic, you refer to both development and enforcement, and economists looking at that immediately think that design is very important as we develop a framework, and that enforcement is fraught with many dangers. So I talk on those two themes, incentives and information, starting with incentives. Looking at things from both the oil and gas companies' perspective and the perspective of, I call it states, but I'm referring in particular to Guyana. As far as the oil and gas sector will go and companies will go, the primary concern is profits, as well as environmental, social, and governance issues, but that depends on, in a sense, the extent to which their shareholders, as well as their host countries, require them to do this. And whether it makes good business sense as well, too, because there's a cost to that. So profits. Now, profits would be simply calculated as revenues minus costs. Whenever there's an increase in costs, there's a reduction in profits. So let's talk about potential sources of increases in costs. First of all, whenever there are more stringent safety, environmental, financial, and economic regulations, there will be an increase in costs. In passing, I might mention that the head of the ExxonMobil Guyana Corporation remarked that the very rapid development, the record-breaking development of the Stabroek block, from its discovery, the discovery in 2015, to production that started in 2019, I think it was December. That was a record-breaking achievement, and it was recognized by Mr. Routledge himself that a significant facilitator in all of that was a facilitating oil and gas set of regulations, a facilitating regulatory framework. If one were to think of the United States, where the framework is much more developed, one would expect that that process will take a longer time. That was recognized by the company itself, the operator itself. So whenever there is this increase in regulations or the stringency of regulations, costs, taken as economic costs and opportunity costs, lost opportunities will increase. Whenever there is an occurrence of risky events, unless those the attendant costs can be shifted to others, if those costs are borne by the company and the investor, there will be a reduction in profits. Just to mention a few things that just happened, there were gas compressor problems. There could be an oil spill, a low probability event. But I might remark that the rapid development, the record-breaking development, would give any regulator pause to wonder whether maybe some elements of safety, for example, might have been overlooked, or some compromises might have been made. This is the most natural thing that a regulator will ask himself or herself. COVID, which was a risky event, it occurred. That would have increased costs, and it would have compromised profits. The Venezuela threat, right now, we might think that it's having no effect, but let us remember that the final investment decision on the pipeline was not made. So any risky event could increase costs in the sense of opportunity costs, and we're thinking merely from the perspective of the company. Profit maximization implies that the company will always, if it can say that it has maximized profits, it would have necessarily minimized costs. And that is the objective of the oil company, and it's a most natural objective for the investor. On the other hand, states have different concerns. States generally are concerned with, and your four challenges, I think you call them, are really excellent ones: sustainable economic growth, equity, and overall welfare. Economic growth generally will increase with investment, but here I pause to mention that once it's foreign direct investment, this complicates the manner in which economic growth and investment are correlated. In market economies, economic growth happens when there is more investment, but our interest is in not just economic growth, but sustainable economic growth, which generally means particular kinds of investment that might mean either returns that occur in the longer run as against shorter run, investments that might actually cost more, diminishing profits for an investor. So it is sustainable economic growth we're interested in, and that would mean particular kinds of investment. Equity, another interest of the state, is often achieved by policies that can compromise economic growth. And thirdly, welfare, the welfare of citizens, we might note, is not necessarily about the welfare of investors alone. Investors comprise an element of GDP and an element of the population and the society. So the point I'm making here is that given the objectives of the regulated entity, in this case, all companies, versus the incentives of a state, that the two sets of incentives sometimes work at cross purposes. Indeed, if they don't, all of a sudden we have the regulated entity and the regulator being on the very same page. If that were the case, we're saying that there is no divergence of interests, and something would be wrong there, rather wrong, or in point of fact, it could be rather right. But certainly something is something is a bit of an anomaly when the two sets of incentives are well aligned. So that's incentives on the one hand. Secondly, now I want to see something about information. The basis on which we regulate companies, any company whatsoever, is information. Effective regulation requires not just information, but particular quality of information. Let me give you some examples. There was an increase in flaring when the gas compressor problems occurred. That incidentally increase in flaring was first recognized by fishermen, artisanal fishers, because it's not readily, it's not the most natural thing. It's not always costless for a regulated entity to get all the information that's required for effective regulation. Similarly, how much oil is produced becomes a matter as well. When I first engaged with this matter of, this was in 2015 or so, when we first started to think seriously about oil and gas, I remember raising the issue of monitoring and observing how much oil is produced. And at that stage, because we are learning, at that stage, that was felt not to be an issue. I've been reading recently in our papers that is indeed an issue, that the regulator, the government, is now talking about ensuring that we get credible reports on oil production. Wastewater disposal, the effects on fisheries, these are things that require regulation, but regulation can only occur if there is information. What sort of information? Well, that very often depends on the particular regulation, and I've identified some domains here. Safety regulations require information that's pertinent to safety issues. Environmental regulation requires information on things that are pertinent to the environment. Similarly, financial. And when I speak of economic regulation, I stuck in their allocation. I'm thinking about allocation of oil blocks. We've recently used one mechanism, that is to say auctions, to allocate oil blocks. I'm going to use the example of auctions to explain why it is we have to pay keen attention to the design. We can't take it for granted, the design of the regulatory framework. Now, what we're seeing here, and the economists have been saying this for a while, but a Nobel Prize was awarded to Jean Tirole, a Frenchman, a few years ago, precisely because Tirole talked about regulation and the importance of information, recognizing that regulated entities or companies have private information. The information that the oil company has does not become automatically available to the regulator, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency or the fiscal authority. So remember, we're thinking about the regulated entity, the oil companies, and the regulator that might have different agencies. information is private, and there are incentives and strong incentives for regulated entities, oil companies, to keep private information that's valuable to them, to keep that information private. We have what's known as a principal agent problem. We have different incentives. The oil company, as well as the regulator, there are different incentives. Um, and there is private information. Not everything that the regulated entity does can be observed. There is an asymmetry of information, and there is a divergence of interests. To the extent that we cannot observe and monitor, that's to say, the regulator cannot observe and monitor closely the private information that the regulated entity has, it becomes much more difficult to design regulations and and enforcement becomes an issue too. Now, in conclusion, I want to mention how economists have addressed this matter. We talk about designing institutions, something that you talked about, both of you, Terence and David, designing institutions to achieve outcomes that we wish to, we consider desirable. This is putting game theory on its head. This is putting economics on its head, if you will. Because instead of asking ourselves the so-called positive question, what will be the outcome of our current set of institutions, of our choices, of our behavior, instead of asking that question, we say to ourselves, here are the outcomes we'd like to see. What are the institutions that are going to give us those outcomes, given certain things that we know, certain parameters we know about a regulated entity, the oil company? So this is something known as mechanism design. And one of the key elements of mechanism design, incidentally, is something known as the revelation principle. That is to say, designing systems that get the companies that have private information to actually truthfully reveal what that private information is. If we can do that, then we would have properly designed our regulations. Quick example, dividing a pie, dividing a cake, dividing a piece of candy. Robert Aumann, who also won a Nobel Prize for his work on game theory, mentioned that his mother, he had a brother, there were two of them, and whenever they were poor, and whenever there was a piece of candy, let's say chocolate, to divide, there was always a big fight. Instead of them being happy with the division, there was a fight. So the mother struck upon a fantastic mechanism. She said to one of them, let's say Robert, okay, you divide the candy, but your brother is going to choose which piece he gets and takes. It was a fantastic mechanism. There were divergent interests with these two youngsters. Each wanted a bigger piece. There was private information about which one might actually care for what. But in a nutshell, though, this mechanism, which is well known to game theorists, it's about dividing a pie. It ensures that there is a fairness in the outcome by a very simple contrivance. One person divides, the other person chooses. Now, that's metaphorically what we need to achieve in all of the details of our framework. And Terence, your slide was really excellent, both describing what we've achieved and comparing it to what we had before in the earlier legislation. Mechanism design is something that is not, even I as an economist, I struggle with it. And we need to invest heavily Because the alternative is to assume that we will simply design our legislation and our regulations and we will enforce them in a coercive manner. That's the enforcement problem. Because as we know with our mining, the mining officers
Yeah.
or the police officers on the ground, this is not being unkind to anybody, but there are powerful incentives for a regulator to look the other way. And it's very easy to overcome regulations that have to be enforced by coercion. Now,
Yeah.
if instead we try to understand people's incentives, then we will have to depend less on heavy enforcement and by things like the revelation principle being embedded in our regulations, we would be able to more effectively regulate our oil and gas sector. I'm sorry the discussion was really general, but I
No,
think
no, no. I think you, I think you hit it on the head. I mean, look, one of the things that we have argued is that there really needs to be, a less confrontational stance between uh, the state and the regulated entities. We think that this is in the interest of business. Uh, I think the mechanism for doing that you've just sort of, in a sense, outlined that really this is a to move away from, in a sense, we've always wanted to move away from coercive enforcement mechanisms. And I think what you're saying is that if you can have more information sharing between the regulated entities and their regulators, then you can design enforcement mechanisms, or you can design regulatory mechanisms that rely less on enforcement. I mean, look, I think we recently saw the events where the young person who was responsible for adjudicating some aspects related to things that were appropriately accounted for and not accounted for, made an accounting decision that was of the order of $200 million. So these are issues that I think go to how we can do this better, and it speaks to some of the motivations of the regulator to perhaps not to look away from some aspects of the regulation in terms of when it's time for it to be enforced. So I do think that this is, as one of our listeners have just noted, you're making an important contribution towards understanding the critical issues of that we face in this moment. And I think that's something that we've tried to do, that the ideas are important. And so maybe, David, I can ask you to reach in here, give a thought of, we've already, it always seems to me an hour is a large time when you think of it on paper, but we've already gone through. It's already 11:33. So David, give a thought on what you've heard today, and we're at the end of the year. What I'll do is I'll share this widely so that folks can have a good understanding of the discussion. If you can just weigh in at this moment. Yeah.
No, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Terence. My other phrase, as we've known in the webinars, besides work in progress, is this is not nuclear physics. We have trove of experiences around the world of setting up regulatory frameworks in different industries, different sectors, including oil and gas, from which Guyana can benefit from. Mm-hmm. And that has begun to happen. Some people would say slower than what it could be. But basically, you know, markets work. Eventually, what happens is, as say the case of the um, Ministry of Natural Resources, if you remember, in 2019, it was a Department of Energy with one director under the office of the president. And everybody who had any experience in energy development across the world would say, well, no, this is madness. You know, you can't, this isn't an office under the president to be run like, you know, some kind of shop or some kind of project. No, you need to set up a established ministry. In most countries, it's a ministry of energy. In the case of Guyana, I think with the importance of natural resource, climate change, environmental concerns. A decision was made it would be Ministry of Natural Resources and not just energy. But bottom line is encompasses that public sector role of supervision, regulation, establishing laws, systems, procedures under which that sector operates in the geography of the sovereign state of Guyana. That is still work in progress. I envision over the next few years, we would be seeing more iterations of change, of improvement, of efficiency, of institutionalization of the Ministry of Natural Resources. And eventually, because it will be needed, this is not an either or, this is something that is just, you know, required in order to have an effective functioning of both the industry and the relationship of the industry with the government, that we will need a separate regulatory commission, which is autonomous, independent, with resources of its own, which again, Guyana now has resources that it can set that up. And when we look at different experiences, both positive and negative, across the fossil fuel industry world, we see a variety of experiences where this has worked better, this has worked worse, and Guyana can now benefit from that best practice and that benchmark experience across the globe. It also means, and I still remember, as Thomas was mentioned in 2015, as we were all starting to look at this energy situation, that we have moved, as you've mentioned, from a very contestatory, conflictive relationship with the players in the oil and energy space to much more collaboration. Some people would criticize and say they believe there's some sort of collusion. Well, that's the reason why you set up these institutions, these organizations, you establish laws, systems, procedures to prevent that from happening. And we discussed that ad nauseum in our webinar on transparency and corruption some weeks ago. And when that works well, you then have benefits for, as Thomas mentioned, the primary objective of the investor, whether it be foreign or national, which is maximizing profit in its operations, and the public sector, which is maximizing what I call generically the public good. With the caveat that, again, in a country like Guyana, where democratic public participation has been repressed for so many decades, the notion of the public good is, again, work in progress. This is something that is being worked on, different organizations, government. This is not a natural yet in Guyana to discuss what is the public good and what is the role of government in ensuring that public good for all of the people of Guyana. So that is an element there. And then that brings us into what I call a bit of the sort of operational, practical issues with regards to the regulatory framework and the environment. And I'd just like to focus on two today. We've discussed them as well in webinars. So I think people can see that there's been logic in this madness of how we've set up these events over this year and a half. One, technology. New technologies have not only allowed for a company like ExxonMobil and others to now reach deep sea sources of fossil fuels when for decades, maybe centuries, they've known they exist in the sea of in the bottom of the ocean of the Caribbean basin, but we could never reach them. Now those new deep sea exploration technologies make that possible. It's not because some new chairman at Exxon one day decided, oh, I like Guyana, let's go there, let's take over from Shell and let's make this work. No, what happened is the congruence of being in the space, making an investment decision with the Shell operations, and then the click of the new technologies being available and now being able to reach hitherto unreachable sources of hydrocarbons. As a result, we now have, depending on who you speak to, anywhere from 8 to 15 what used to be for decades dormant exploration licenses from Grenada all the way up to Bahamas now being reactivated because every location atop the Caribbean Sea now knows we have oil and gas and many other minerals below, and companies can now reach it. This is a big opportunity, but it's a major challenge now for all these jurisdictions as to what do we do about that, because markets abhor a vacuum. The markets are now telling us there is now a space to develop hitherto untapped extractive resources under the Caribbean Sea, and we can reach it safely, effectively, productively, competitively, and with a profit. So technology is critical here. And what it means then is that on the side of the state, the public good, we need to leverage that technology in order to make the role of achieving that public good more efficient and more reachable for more people in Guyana or any jurisdiction. This is beginning to happen, but as we've seen from our webinars in the banking sector and other sectors, this is 2023, and sometimes people say it looks like this is 1973 in Guyana because we are not leveraging technology to the maximum. So that is a big challenge, a big opportunity on item 1. Item 2, and we discussed this again on the practical side, this requires investment in human resource development and skills development. This will not happen by AI. This has to be people who are trained, prepared to be able to manage all these different interests and information which Thomas has mentioned, not only in the oil and gas sector, but it has to be managed in banking, in financial services, in construction. Every other month, there is a story about lax supervision in the infrastructure construction projects across Guyana, housing, hotels, roads, bridges. It's not necessarily corruption. Somebody has been paid to look the other way. No, lack of human capability in these ministries in Guyana to manage the boom of permit requests, of requirements, of supervision, just because it is physically, humanly overwhelming. So when we discussed the issue of skills development, it is not only, an economy that's growing at 56, 34, 26% a year of only 800,000 people is going to need, within the next decade, max, another 400,000 people in the country to service this growing economy. It's not just an issue of what the migration policy is going to be. It's an issue of training and preparing the skills force for a future which is probably going to be much more on the growth side than on the decline side. And again, I emphasize not only in the energy sector, because eventually, and the companies themselves tell us this, we are going to hit a cap on energy growth in Guyana. These are our projections. But as we've been seeing, anybody who visits Guyana recently would tell you, unless you go out and look at what's going on in the bay and in the areas of oil and gas production, this place is hot on everything. Food and beverage, construction, retail, services, entertainment, everything. You need skilled people, managers, technicians, workers to handle all this in a manner that is orderly And that works, again, going back to the dichotomy, for the investor, both foreign and domestic, and for the public good. Otherwise, you're going to get a major asymmetry, which is going to create a break in that collaborative system. So I'm going to leave it there with those. But again, I foresee that we're going to see much more progress on the Ministry of Natural Resources just because the market is going to force it. But at the same time, I think it's a great opportunity to be able to drill down deep, pardon the pun, on how we maximize the public good opportunities for the people of Guyana, because at the end of the day, that is all that all this oil and gas is worth for. How does it improve the living conditions of the Guyanese people?
Yeah.
Do I get to
Yes,
comment,
yes,
to
you can.
respond?
And as you do, a sort of one particular question came in for you, which I wanted you to kind of take a so the broad question is sort of, are we going, you know,
Actually, this is something I wanted to talk about because I was going to take off from a point that David mentioned. You know, we economists, well, most of economics that occurs, the new movements, the new changes, the new theories, they generally have they emerge in stable economies, well-structured economies. So I talked about the incentives and information, but what David talked about, human capital constraints in our regulatory agencies, even, that's something that has to be considered. And I'm glad that you mentioned it, David. Simple little example. There's this massive construction boom, and if you were in Guyana, you would know that it's major. But colleagues have been telling me that our building codes are outdated. Not only are we rolling out building, construction, infrastructure at a rapid pace, a pace that suggests that maybe we're not even observing the old building codes.
Mhm.
We don't have new building codes. And that is a serious worry because if we took the total economy, the public good, as David put it, if we took that into serious consideration, we will ask ourselves, what will our landscape look like if indeed we've made mistakes in building? Yeah, if we change our time horizon. So indeed we have to get expertise on board. And the way I might respond to, or it's not to disagree in any way with this question here, is to say the following: as we think of our skills need, as we think of um, our, our vision for a new Guyana, we'd be making a very big mistake if we regarded our new opportunities in oil as an uptick. It is not an uptick. It is a change. It
Mhm.
is and we cannot depend on simply doing better with what we've been doing before. We have to recognize that we need a vision that sees a completely different Guyana, and that it will indeed be a completely different set of capabilities. So to conclude, I do want to comment then, David, that even in our regulatory capacity and execution of our functions as regulatory agencies,
Mhm.
there needs to be a quantum leap. I remember I used to be at the Bank of Guyana, and this is not telling stories, that I shouldn't tell. But at a central bank, the letters that emanate from the central bank would normally be the bank with a capital B. I remember seeing, this was back in the day, Republic Bank in particular, writing the Bank of Guyana, saying the bank is of the view, and it was referring to Republic Bank. Regulatory stance is important. And the perspective, the view that the regulated entities have of the regulator is salient in our ability to regulate. Now, for both of these things to happen, that is to say, our regulatory stance to improve, to be what it should be, and for the regulated entity to regard the regulator as competent, efficient, there has to be this quantum leap that I'm telling you about. So those are my comments, and I wanted to comment on them as a takeoff to what you said, David.
No, I appreciate that. And actually, just you mentioned all this when it happens in stable, mature markets with established institutions. I'd remind people just about 15 years ago, when the massive construction boom took off in South Florida, we started seeing every other month scandals about not meeting construction requirements, Chinese drywall with cancerous products and all sorts of things, which at one point the government of Florida kind of put a hold on everything because they said, there's no point in this boom if we're not meeting the regulatory standards for the future. And of course, we saw that building that collapsed just last year. So what happens is when you have this pressure of fast force market growth, as you now have in Guyana, the imperatives for everybody, even the individual citizen who's trying to now build a new bathroom in their home or expand a driveway in their yard, is I need to get this done and it should happen and I have the money and I want to pay in it. So multiply that to the level of the foreign investor or the local investor, a Demerara or Guyana Bank and so on. And it just gets so complicated because the staffing in the public sector and skills and technology is not moving at the same speed. And this is something that's it can create, anybody who knows production systems, that's all you need. One little widget which goes out of sync and the entire production line of the new Tesla is stopped and the entire EV industry is all of a sudden stopped. Well, we're not talking at those levels, and I know this is something because we've discussed it with ministers on the programs, with people in government. They're working on it, but I think we need to be aware of the fact that there is and this is in your line, Professor, mathematician, there is a gap between the exponential growth and the arithmetic resources to deal with that exponential growth.
Well, in a sense, it wouldn't. If one is growing in an arithmetic sense and the other is growing exponential, it's going to be very hard for them to catch up. I'll say that.
And you don't need a PhD in mathematics, do you?
PhD in mathematics to see that. No. So these conversations can really go on, and I suppose that's been one of the challenges of planning the webinar. Sometimes we haven't had too much to talk about on one program, but somehow you're often trying not to make it too narrow so that you don't get this overarching sense of what the structural issues are in a particular context. So I'll perhaps take this as the last one, and I'll give you the comment. How do you assess kind of how well we're, even within our current regular context, is it efficient enough? Are courts working as effectively or they're working clearly, but are they kind of engaging the technology and the other things that David has talked about? Is the human resource development within the context of our judicial sphere to more effectively manage what's happening here? How would you assess where that's going, and what sort of ideas are there for improvement in that context?
Is that directed to me?
Yes, that was directed at you.
I'm going to answer that, and also at the same time make reference to the comment that was made by Andre. Um, it is far, far easier in any society for there to be the observance of rules and the adoption of new rules if there are social norms that support that process. If, on the other hand, our society is at a different place, operating at a different pace, trapped in norms that are relevant for a country and an economy that never had oil, then the order of magnitude, be it in the courtroom or on the streets with the traffic regulators or the engineers choosing which material to build, the order of magnitude of ensuring that laws are followed, that laws are, first of all, adequate and followed, and that the regulatory framework is the sort of framework that will deliver on our vision, that becomes incredibly more difficult. And I worry that it's not merely the adoption of technology, but we need to have supporting norms in society. And we don't necessarily have that.
So, well, colleagues, it's
Let me
11:56, and we've
just
gone
add
almost
something.
30 minutes over. So, David, your comment, and then we can begin to bring to a close.
Right. No, I think on the question, where is Guyana? Well, Guyana is just starting. I've mentioned this. People tend to assume that because you've got this major global player, Exxon and others investing, and the growth in the economy, that this is a mature, stable market economy. It is not. This is an emerging market, not only in the terms of what economics means by an emerging market, it is an emerging market in the social, political, and cultural understanding of what a free market economy is. There are still established, legitimate players in the Guyana polity who do not believe in free market enterprise, who do not believe in private sector capitalism. And they have legitimate supporters in Guyana. And this goes back, as I've said, to generations of that DNA of state run economic development. And they may not be in influential positions right now, but as I mentioned to everybody all the time, electoral politics is, pardon my French, is a bitch. Things
Mhm.
can change overnight, and all of a sudden, it is not preposterous or crazy to say that some of these people end up in positions to influence change in Guyana in a different way. So it's work in progress. It is starting. It is this experience. I think what's stimulating is what I see of the young generation, the under 40s in Guyana, how they have embraced this new freedom of economic, political space to do things differently than what their parents and their grandparents and their great grandparents had to do. So I think that's something key. And on the specific question, because this has come up many times, the OECD recommendation of a 15% minimal corporate tax for large corporations, and that in the CARICOM space, only Guyana and Suriname have not approved it. Well, let me remind people that regardless of size and our delusional notion of LDCs and MDCs in CARICOM, well, it turns out that Guyana and Suriname are probably our two markets that are most behind, both in terms of calendar time and also in terms of substance, in terms of experiencing foreign investment. So we can't just say, oh, well, Jamaica, who's been in the middle of foreign direct investment since the 1950s and before independence with bauxite and other sectors, and now Guyana, which went through 4 decades of state-run anti-foreign investment. We're going to say, yeah, it's equally easy for Guyana to implement 15%. We don't have one generation yet of Guyanese who have lived under an economic regime of free market enterprise and foreign and local investment. So adjusting to a global 15% tax on large foreign corporations in a market that has almost no experience in that until the recent decade, it's not the same. And Suriname, I would remind people, except for state-run corporations, up to a few years ago, was being run by a military dictatorship. So again, it is not the same to say, but Barbados does it. Why can't the others do it? Bahamas does it. Bahamas is an economic appendage of the Florida tourism industry. So they've been in this for centuries. It's not the same. So we need to make those adjustments and those qualifications. And we also need to be very much aware, Thomas's admonition, the public good. That is the role of government. How do we manage this for the public good? So let me leave it at that.
I think we just had the following heated comment pop in. And so maybe if we can use this comment as a way of, so there are obviously some anti-free market capitalists who are watching the program, who seem to think that, we need something more like Singapore or Rwanda or Taiwan to change these cultural norms or these social norms or to rapidly, the question, how do we rapidly evolve these social and cultural norms so as to be able to manage effectively? And maybe we need, maybe your free market capitalism is too chaotic, and we need a bit more authoritarian planning to enforce this regulatory environment. So it's 12:02, so we have to close here. So I'll give each person 1 minute to respond. So I'll go to you first, Thomas, and then I'll defer to you, David, to respond and to say thank you on our behalf and to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays and so on, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Terence. And I'd like to say thank you again for allowing me here. My closing comment is that it's fascinating that our concluding remarks had to do with, our ideological position, because as it turns out, the father of mechanism design theory, he was actually addressing the issue of our inability to talk about precisely these ideological issues. So let me call us to think about once again that the nature of designing and enforcing regulations, that markets do not ever exist without some basic ingredients like trust and morality. And that we should think of regulation as working with markets to achieve outcomes that we all believe would be acceptable.
Oh, thank you. David?
Yes, no, I think my last comments were enough. And obviously, the changes that take place in Guyana and where they go, those are for the Guyanese to determine. And we will be having another election soon. And all of these elements and forces should debate and compete openly and freely in the political marketplace. And that is the essence of electoral democracy. And I think that's also work in progress and growing in Guyana. And it's just compounded by the challenges and opportunities of all this economic growth. But that's par for the course. And my experience, having started visiting Guyana in 1982, boy, way better than what it was back then. I prefer this one than that one. So I'll leave it there. Let me thank everybody. This is very timely because episode 8 on Wednesday, January 10th is going to be on investment promotion. And that is a big issue coming up in Guyana. We recently had a forum in London with Peter Ramsaroop of Go Invest. And many of these issues that we've been discussing about regulatory environment, the role of foreign investment, local investment, and so on, will certainly be on that agenda. So I invite you all to mark it in your calendar after you go through your Christmas and New Year holidays with good health and prosperity for all. And thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming in. And I just wanted to add one last note. One of the guests that I tried to get for this program is a former Minister of Education. His name was Henry Jeffries. And he is one of those who sort of argues that this political dynamic is intractable. And so this question that you raise about, hoping that our under 40s will kind of more embrace this larger is something that I hope we will come back to and have a discussion. So it's this challenge of understanding the technical nature of what we're engaged in. Where we began, I think it's a very critical point to reemphasize on the end, which is that low probability events do occur, and we're seeing them occur. And these low probability events often have a high impact on our economic and social well-being. And the question for us is how to, in some sense, what mechanism do we have for designing a society that leads to the outcomes that we view broadly or intuitively sense as those which are good ones for Guyana? And there are many voices here and many thoughts here, and I look forward to the continuing conversation. And again, Merry Christmas to all, Happy Kwanzaa, a Happy New Year, and we look forward to the conversation. And thank you once again, Thomas, for always your very insightful observations in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best, everybody.